Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to do something a little bit different. Today we're going to discuss if it could be possible to see a Total War Warhammer 40,000 game. So without further ado, let's begin. Warhammer 40,000, a behemoth of an IP owned by Games Workshop. Based in the grim dark future of the 41st millennium, this futuristic sci-fi series has dominated the tabletop scene for decades. Also expanding towards a massive amount of novels, video games, some great and some not so good, that one film that nobody really talks about or likes to acknowledge, and soon enough we'll also have a bunch of TV shows. Warhammer 40,000 has always been their biggest IP. Games Workshop are obviously completely aware of this. This is why the Space Marine has always been their poster boy. They attract many new potential customers each and every day, but even then, the cost of entry can also be quite alarming to some people, where being able to field an army without counting the cost of paints, glue and so on would cost you a few £100s. So in an effort to further promote their products, Games Workshop have worked with a variety of different game developers in an effort to produce video games. And this has been rather successful. I've honestly met a bunch of players who started the hobby after being introduced to Warhammer through a series of games, video games such as Space Marine, Dawn of War, Total War Warhammer, Vermintide. These are all video games that have sold very well and have attracted many new potential players towards the hobby, with Total War Warhammer being perhaps the largest one. As per Steam statistics, even though this series is quite long running at this point, it still attracts tens of thousands of players each day. And doesn't look like it's going to slow down anytime soon, as we're still due a third and final game of the series and many more DLC packs. Now, has this introduced many people to the tabletop? Definitely. I have seen many posts online of people who've played Total War Warhammer who wanted to experience the tabletop, more specifically Warhammer Fantasy, only to have been met with the fact that Warhammer Fantasy is a no longer supported system and now Age of Sigmar has replaced it. A lot of players did end up trying Warhammer 40,000 or Age of Sigmar, considering the fact that those were the only possible options, but the majority of them wanted Warhammer Fantasy. That was the setting that they had grown accustomed to through this video game, which many believe was the reason why Games Workshop eventually announced Warhammer the Old World, a new tabletop game based in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, but we're not going to get into that, that's a topic for another day. Now, given the success of the Total War Warhammer series, would Games Workshop and Creative Assembly be interested in creating a Total War Warhammer 40,000 series? There are a few points to discuss here, mostly in Creative Assembly's part, but we're going to look at Games Workshop first. Given the success of the Total War Warhammer series, and obviously the potential amount of customers they could have if they could market a game which is currently already live and supported, it would be absolutely silly for Games Workshop not to flirt with the possibility. Especially when the topic of Total War Warhammer 40,000 pops up on various forums and subreddits every now and then, usually attracting many views and comments. So naturally, working with Creative Assembly once again could prove to be very profitable for them. But now we need to look towards Creative Assembly. Total War Warhammer was by far their most ambitious project to date. We have to take into account that all previous projects were based on a historical setting, so most of their model assets were based around humans and animals, which could be easily reskinned if they needed to work on something new, but still use the same basic skeleton. Whereas in Total War Warhammer they had to animate monsters, demons, undead, so the workload itself was massive compared to any other Total War game. Now, given the fact that the Total War Warhammer series was so wildly successful, it could be more than possible that Creative Assembly are looking towards other possible fantasy settings to base new games on. Now, you might have noticed that I said fantasy and not sci-fi. This is because at this point the Total War Warhammer development team would have been rather used to fantasy asset creation in terms of monsters, magic and all other things related to any sort of fantasy setting. So should they end up working on a new project, say for example Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, they should already have a decent enough of a footing to know where things are going to go. But if they decide to work on a sci-fi setting, specifically that of Warhammer 40,000, things get drastically more complicated. In terms of art assets, Warhammer 40,000 has a very specific term of style, and everything does vary quite differently. Loads of races are very extremely unique, especially when you start comparing different races and factions such as the Space Marines with Tyranids and Tau for example. And then obviously you'd have to take into account the amount of unique looking vehicles aircraft, battlesuits, and really so much more that we could list here. However, they do have something that works in their benefit. Despite the many amounts of different races and factions, many more can be introduced by simple recolors or reskins, and I'm going to use the Space Marines as an example here. The Space Marines are the poster boys for the Warhammer 40,000 universe, so this one would be the easiest one to look at. Once they create the basic framework for a fully playable faction, say for example the Ultramarines, they then have a strong basis for creating other chapters, as most others would be simple recolors or reskins. And even then, they already would have the basic model framework to be able to work on more unique looking Space Marine chapters such as the Salamanders, which even then would pretty much just be a reskin with a few extra units which are unique to those factions. This might prove to be a bit more difficult for other factions such as the Chaos Space Marines, as they do have a generalized generic look, but they've also got very unique warbands such as the Thousand Sons and the Death Guard. But in most cases, most races and factions are pretty much all the same visually, barring different paint jobs. And obviously I'm talking about this in a purely aesthetic sense, not in terms of rules and combat. So technically the work has been lightened as it is, but that's not the only thing we need to look at. Where would such a setting take place? There are hundreds if not thousands of established worlds in the lore of Warhammer 40,000, and despite the sheer scope and scale of some of these worlds, it would be rather impossible to set it in just one. Mainly because to somehow set a game in one world, with every single established race and faction conveniently being on that world, is impossible in terms of lore. Sure, this could happen if it was based on the Horus Heresy with the Siege of Terra, where all established legions were fighting around the same planet. But the Horus Heresy is not their big ticket item, it's Warhammer 40,000 as it's always been. So in terms of setting, it would either have to have the whole galaxy as a playable sandbox, or a small cluster of systems that somehow link a number of races together. This could also be split into a multi-part game series such as Total War Warhammer, where you would normally get one cluster of systems and a mega campaign. Then on the second game you'd have another cluster of systems with a mega campaign linking game 1 and 2, and then finally for game 3 you'd have a final cluster of systems and a big mega campaign. Obviously we don't know if this could be a 2-part series, 3-part series, or even longer, but it could be much longer than, say for example, Total War Warhammer, as the setting in Warhammer 40,000 is massively larger than Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Now we could look towards how races could be potentially introduced. Normally in the base games of Total War Warhammer, we're used to the setting of 2 good factions and 2 evil factions per release, with some following race packs being added in as time progresses. The thing with Warhammer 40,000, however, is that there is technically no good and no evil. Everything seems to go in a morally grey area. So instead of seeing 4 races and factions at launch, I actually envision 3 different factions instead, where we'd see one Imperium-based faction and race, another Chaos-based faction and race, and finally one Xenos. Xenos are generally alien races for those not used to the 40k terminology. So say for example, with a Game 1 launch, we could see Space Marines versus Chaos Space Marines and maybe Eldar for the Xenos race. And then slowly but surely we could start seeing race packs, for example the Astra Militarum or Imperial Guard as they're commonly known, leading towards different races and factions via different DLC packs and race packs, until then moving on to a possible second or even third game. Which if they do go on the multi-game route, hopefully they'll work in the same way as Total War Warhammer does, where they all eventually link. Honestly, a Total War Warhammer 40,000 game does seem quite possible when you talk about it mostly in a visual aspect. But then we have to take into account gameplay, in both campaign and in battles. First we'll look towards the battle section. You see, most of the established units in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, be it units, tanks, aircraft and so on, are generally ranged combat focused, where some of the races and factions in the setting have around 80% of their actual roster being ranged combat focused. So they'd need to find a way to make pure ranged combat battles engaging for the player, or else people will start to get rather bored and start leaving the game. But whilst we're on the topic of battles, we need to look at battle maps and terrain. Generally, in every single Total War game that's been released, the battle maps are usually quite bare in terms of terrain, not counting anything such as sieges and village maps and so on, but in most cases they're just open fields, maybe with a few hills and mountains, but nothing too, well, complex. In most cases these maps are quite bare, and it does make a lot of sense since most of your army is melee focused, so you want to get your troops in there as soon as possible rather than wasting time trying to maneuver around terrain. In Warhammer 40,000 however, especially in the tabletop, terrain placement is very important as it can make or break your game. You want forms of cover and strategic locations. If the map is completely bare, you're pretty much just having two armies firing at each other and that's it. That honestly doesn't sound very fun, does it? So the maps themselves would have to be made much more complex than what we're normally used to as Total War players. Which honestly I'm all for. It's about time that we started getting more complex maps into the Total War series. Now they've been adding a lot more, especially in the Total War Warhammer series where we've got more condensed maps with choke points and so on, but even then these are still rather bare in terms of Warhammer 40,000 standards. And then we'd have to look at the possible campaign. How would such a campaign work? Would we be focused on one planet or in multiple of systems? How would we be able to move armies about, especially going onto different planets? Will they be space battles or will it just be auto-resolved? Will different planets be represented by only one battle map that could then be upgraded into a fortress or a forge world or a hive world? Or would a planet be separated into say 3 different continents that you'd have to take over and possibly get some benefits from? This would be such a massive, drastically different Total War game that it would not be compared to any other, and it might present a bit of a challenge to the Total War team should they ever go into a project such as this, considering the fact that most if not everything would have to be created from the ground up. If anything, this would be considered a truly unique Total War game. Now there is something that works in their benefit here. A certain race, the Chaos Demons, are actually from both universes, so eventually when the Chaos Demons do get released in Total War Warhammer, those models could be exported and updated into the Total War Warhammer 40,000 game, which already gives the developers a head start when it comes to creating new races and factions. They'd have access to the demons of Slaanesh, Nurgle, Khorne and Tzeentch. Now I'm not saying that that's the reason why they should work on a Total War Warhammer 40,000 game, but I imagine that something like that would help them quite a bit as they'd already have one fully fledged race and faction sorted out. Honestly, in my real honest opinion, I'm not too sure a Total War Warhammer 40,000 game would ever even be possible. I know a lot of fans would like to see this happen, and to be honest, I would like to see it too. I'm a big fan of the Warhammer 40k universe. It's something that's always been a big part of my life, same as fantasy, just at a smaller degree of course, but something like this, especially when you have to take into account a sci-fi universe, might be a bit too much deviation from what normally everyone is used to from the Total War series of games. Historical and fantasy games at least have some sort of stuff that ties them together, whereas the sci-fi universe is so drastically different. But what do you guys think? Do you think a Total War Warhammer 40,000 game would indeed be possible? Do you have any ideas on how the campaign map would also work? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and let's start a bit of a discussion, shall we? But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel as it really does help us out. In the description section below, we have various different social media links such as Facebook, Instagram and Discord, where you can get in contact with the Great Book team, talk to us about Total War, Warhammer, or just anything really. Also in the description section below is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could get loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Purchasing using this link and also using our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons, your support means the world to us. Honestly, it's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A special thank you to our patrons Gibraltar LUSC and Ryan Bertsche for subscribing to us at our Fane level. Honestly, you guys are super cool. And a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing and commenting on these videos. Honestly, the channel's been growing a lot lately and it's all thanks to you guys. Without you, the Great Book would be nothing. We're trying to implement more videos into the channel soon, but we're getting stuff done outside of YouTube at the moment, just like artwork and so on for the channel. It's just taking a little while to get everything to look to a standard that we feel is cool. Honestly guys, thank you so much for all the support lately, it's been amazing. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.